Hey, how you doing?
Good. How's it going?
All is well, all is well. Thank you so much for coming on the platform. I really appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time to talk about the work.
Oh, definitely, definitely. I'm very interested in the work that you're doing, and I got to take my hat off to you. You're doing some major things. For the guests that may not recognize you, let them know who you are and definitely where you're from.
Yeah, so I'm Dr. Laurie Santos. I'm a professor of psychology at Yale and host of the Happiness Lab podcast. And I study the science of happiness. I'm trying to figure out all the things that we can do to improve our lives and feel better.
Wow, wow, that's tremendous. That's tremendous. So I guess I want to ask you, when did you develop a passion for psychology? Was that something that you got into early on or later in life?
Yeah, so I was always kind of interested in people, and so psychology was sort of a natural like field that I wound up kind of getting into. My passion for happiness though happened a little bit later. I'd been studying psychology for a really long time, but I started getting really interested in mental health when I took on a new role at Yale. I was a professor there for a while, but then I started in this new role, which is called the head of college, and in that role, I live on campus with students, and so I was really seeing students' day to day life, kind of eating with them in the dining hall and hanging out with them. And what I was seeing was this young people's mental health crisis up close and personal. I was dealing with students who are experiencing depression and anxiety, panic attacks, suicidality. And what I wanted to do is something to like help. And having trained in psychology, I knew like, hey, there's all these things that my field knows you can do to sort of feel better. And so I said, well, why don't I develop a new class? I'll sort of develop this new class that teaches students everything that we can do to feel better. I called it Psychology and the Good Life, so it sounded kind of cool. I wanted to sort of pop from the course catalog. But what I didn't expect was that so many students would take it. The first time I offered the class, a quarter of the entire Yale student body tried to enroll, which I think is telling. I think there's lots of students who are feeling stressed out, feeling overwhelmed, and they really want some strategies they can use to feel better.
Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing. I was looking online and it had said that I guess your class became the most popular class in the history of Yale. If you could talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was something we didn't really expect, but I think it tells us something really important. I think it tells us that students like really want to learn about this stuff, right? I think they're really starving for strategies they can use to feel better. I mean, the world is a tough place right now, the US, we're kind of facing this election as you and I are having this conversation, right? There's lots of political polarization, the climate's messed up, the economy's messed up, right? And I think that, especially students in the US right now are looking for some answers of can they do to kind of feel less overwhelmed, to feel less stressed.
Wow, that's amazing. You're making history, and you helping people, you changing lives. I guess what I want to say is like I think sometimes the older generations, like maybe my parents and grandparents, they look at the younger generation and they say, you going to school, you enjoying your life, you having a good time. College, that should be easy, that should be fun. But like you mentioned, a lot of students is depressed, they stress, they have anxiety. If you could talk about that, how do those things, I guess, work in conjunction with being a student? Because you usually associate those things with like maybe like a very traumatic experience.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the thing that's so striking. And one of the reasons like the class just didn't become popular at Yale, but like, you've heard about the class. A lot of people have heard about this class. I think it's sort of fascinating to people that these students who are at Yale University, right, one of the best universities in the world, like they're 19, they have their whole life ahead of them. But so many of them are just experiencing, depression, anxiety, and so on. As you said, this is something we associate with trauma or really terrible life circumstances, right? These students aren't experiencing that for the most part, right? So why are they experiencing such bad mental health? And I think there's lots of different reasons. I think, as you mentioned, students today are experiencing lots more stress. I think there's a lot more academic pressure on students, especially in the US. I think also this is the first generation to deal with technology and social media. And I think there's lots of growing evidence that kind of social media may not be so great in terms of our depression and anxiety and things like that. And so I think that this is, and also this is a generation that's navigating, a really uncertain future ahead with climate and the economy and so much stuff going on. And so I think there are particular pressures that this generation faces. But it's worth noting it's not just students, right? If you look just generationally, young people right now are more unhappy than they've ever been. And the World Happiness Report suggests that that pattern is true, maybe not just in the US, but at least across most of Europe and the UK, these kinds of things. Not as much so in the global South, but overall, this generation of young people across the world, on average, is more unhappy than we've seen in generations past.
Wow. Wow, man. That's crazy. Now I'm from Cleveland. I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio, and recently it was an article, and I'm not sure how accurate it was, but it was just saying like Cleveland is the most stressed city in America, and I think Detroit was like number two, so
Mhm.
that's just crazy.
Yeah, and I think there's lots of, in the US, I think when you see populations that really are unequal in terms of like their wealth level and things like that, I think we often assume that, if you had lots of money, you'd be happier. But what you find is that, wealth at a certain point doesn't really increase your happiness as long as you've got enough money to, keep a roof over your head, put food on the table, and not be stressed about that. The evidence suggests that getting more wealth doesn't really make you as happy as you think. But one thing that can affect happiness, everyone's happiness, is inequality. So there's lots of research that unequal cities, unequal countries wind up being relatively unhappy. And so that's interesting in the US. The US is a relatively wealthy country, especially if you look, compared to like so many other nations in the world. But we're a very like unequally wealthy country, right? There's a lot of people who are struggling, and a lot of people who are really well off. And that means that there's a hit on happiness for everybody in that unequal wealthy nation.
Yeah, yeah, you made a good point because I'm currently in Ghana, and I feel like not only Ghana but other parts of Africa, a lot of the people they seem happier. And then sometimes, you might assume, but even though they have like, maybe less opportunities, they may have less access to money and technology and different things like that. You still see children outside playing. They still playing soccer. They rolling tires. They, throwing rocks and stuff like that. But when I go back home to say Cleveland, it seems like more children are inside. They're on social media. They're on the
Mhm.
game. We played the game when we was younger, but we still wanted to be outside first and foremost.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the interesting things you see when you look at young people today is that they're just much less social. Like they're just physically around other people less often, right? And it's because they have screens, they can kind of interact on screens. But from a psychological perspective, it's probably better to be like hanging out on the street with your friends than like just sort of talking to people over this like little, tiny black box that you're staring at this screen. And so I think that's one of the reasons that we're seeing such a big dip in happiness is that young people are more lonely than ever. And that's in part because like they're just like not hanging out with each other. Back in my day it was like on the street or at malls, like there were these spaces that you could go to like hang out with one another. But that's just not as much the case, or even if those spaces exist, like people don't use them, right? Because they're just kind of at home in front of a screen.
Yeah, that's so true. That's so true. Now I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the happiness courses. Now you have one for adults and you have one for people under 18. Now I actually signed up and I got to check it out a little bit, but if you could talk about that for the viewers.
Yeah, well, when we taught the class at Yale and it became so popular on campus, I got a lot of, emails and letters from people saying like, "Hey, it's not just for Yale students. A lot of us need this class. Can you help us out?" And so, in collaboration with Yale, we put the class online for free so that anyone could take it, a kind of shorter version of the class. It's on Coursera.org, which is the site that kind of gives away lots of digital learning classes for free or for kind of reduced like prices and stuff. And so we have the class on there. It's called The Science of Wellbeing, and anybody can take it. And it was pretty amazing when we first launched the class. It was a bit before the pandemic, but once COVID-19 hit, I think everybody was home and people were really struggling with their own mental health. We just had a ton of learners sign up. And so now we're at over 4 million learners who've taken the class, which is really incredible. And that kind of raised a new question, which is I get a lot of emails from parents saying, "Hey, this is great, but given this crisis that we're seeing in young people, could you make this content available for teenagers or people who are even younger? And so we redid a new version of the class that was meant for students in middle school and high school. That's called The Science of Wellbeing for Teens, and that's up on both Coursera and YouTube because lots of teenagers are on YouTube. And that, even though it's only been up just for over a year, has over 100,000 learners. And so really shows that people are really hungry for this stuff. They really want to learn what they can do to feel better.
Wow, that's amazing. That's really amazing. You're helping millions of people. Wow. Let me see. Now you have a podcast, the Happiness Lab podcast. If you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So, another thing we heard from people was like, it's great that you're sharing this content and putting a class up, but, I'm a young mom, I'm stressed, like I have to, like working like full time, like there's no way I'm going to take a whole Ivy League class, thank you very much. And so that kind of made us realize like it would be great to sort of share some of this material in a different way. And so that was why we came up with the Happiness Lab podcast. It's a way to share a lot of these insights, just in like a podcast format, just like this podcast, right? Where people can just hear people chatting and learn about some of these strategies. And so that's been another way that we've been able to kind of share this content. And we've been blessed to have a lot of really interesting people come on the show. People like activists like Malala have come on. We've got lots of scientists and things like that. Actors like Rob Lowe and Tony Hale have come on. And so it's been kind of a great way to share this message and to share other people's stories as well.
Okay, that's cool. That's cool. Now I wanted to ask you about some of the topics that you previously discussed on the podcast and other platforms. Um, I guess the first one I want to ask you about is overcoming stress. If you can kind of speak to that a little bit, or
Yeah.
your experience overcoming stress.
Yeah, well, I think, if you talk to people about the things that are messing with their mental health, I feel like stress is pretty high on the list, right? We all feel a little bit stressed out at work or stressed out about family life or just stressed out about what's going on, in the economy and in politics right now. And I think that so many of us think of stress in a sort of bad way, right? We assume that stress is really like it's going to mess us up, that it's debilitating, right? But there's lots of evidence that the way stress works in the body is actually there to help us, right? When your like fight or flight system gets activated, that means your heart's pumping more, it's getting more energy to your blood, right? Your pupils are dilating, so you notice stuff more effectively. Like what your body is trying to do is sort of trying to help you. And so one of the things we explore on this podcast is this idea that, well, hang on, maybe if we started to think about stress as more helpful rather than being our enemy, maybe it's our friend, right? And we talked to researchers who've done some studies, like basically telling people, hey, reminder, like your stress is really useful for you. And what he finds is that this can actually help people not just experience like stress more effectively, right? So stress feels less bad in their body, but also it becomes more effective. And it was actually one of the really cool studies. This guy, this guy David Yeager did this work in low income neighborhoods with minority students, right? So he was looking at these kind of low income high schools where students face a whole ton of stressors all the time. And what he finds is that the simple act of sort of training them, hey, remember, stress is really useful, right? It's actually helping your body, winds up meaning that they experience less chronic stress, like they have less negative effects of stress, but more they feel more ready to handle the stresses when they do come up. And so that's pretty cool. It means that we don't necessarily have to change the stressors that we all face in life, right? Which is hard. I mean, it'd be great to get rid of all our stress, right? But that's probably not happening. But just kind of reframing the way we think about stress, it turns out that can have a really beneficial effect for how stress affects our bodies and our minds.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Because sometimes those stressful situations, might make you in the situation. And you're like, I got to figure this out. How I'm gonna do this, and then once you come to that, conclusion, and you get the job done, just like the students, they probably stressed out. And then at the end of the semester, they get their grade, they get their diploma. They figure it was worth it.
Yeah, totally, totally.
Let me see. Okay, now a lot of people they use the term stress, anxiety, depression. What are the differences? Are they related or?
Yeah, totally. So stress we usually think of as kind of there's some stressor out there, right? So there's some event that makes you scared or upset. So if you're one of my college students, it's like you have a test coming up, or maybe you have kind of, a big thing coming up at work. Maybe you're experiencing, money crises, or maybe you have a family member who has like an illness or something. Those are like what scientists might call an external stressor. That's the thing outside. But stress in the body is your sort of body's reaction to that, right? Your heart starts, pumping up, right? You get really kind of like the butterflies in your stomach. Maybe you even experience like headaches or kind of, tension in your face and in your muscles and things. That's the body's reaction to stress. And it's really just a biological process, right? That's aimed at kind of giving us the energy we need to face some sort of threat. The problem is that for stress, it's usually the thing that we're built to face are these sort of short-term threats, right? Your body's built in case there's like a tiger that jumps out at you. Back in the old days, that's what our stresses would be. It wouldn't be some like exam or some sort of stressful bill that shows up in the mail. But nowadays, our stress winds up being a little bit more chronic, meaning it's not just one event that's one and done. It's kind of an ongoing set of stressors that stick with us. And that means that we're kind of running the body's program of kind of, hyping ourselves up for far too long. And then that's where we get to be a problem. But that's often how scientists think about stress. When we think about something like depression, that's a little bit different. That's usually considered like almost like a clinical syndrome where individuals are experiencing a sense of persistent sort of sadness over time. It's almost been described as sort of, looking through these sort of gloomy gray glasses where you're kind of evaluating everything in a different way. So you're feeling something different, you're feeling sad, but you're also thinking in a different way. You're assuming things will be negative. That's a sense of depression. And you can be sort of depressed for a day, maybe you're having a tough day, but a lot of times clinicians think of depression as more chronic. And that's what we all might talk about in terms of clinical depression. When we're thinking about anxiety, that's another case where our thinking and our feelings are messed up. So the feeling in the case of anxiety is usually fear, right? You're really worried about something, that something negative is going to happen. But in addition, there's also thought patterns that go along with anxiety, right? You're really like kind of paying attention to some threat, right? You're kind of looking out for something that feels scary. And again, that's a kind of useful response in the short term, but over time that can turn into chronic anxiety, which can, wind up plaguing you in lots of different ways. And so those are just some definitions of the way social scientists think about these different mental health issues.
Okay, okay. Thank you for breaking that down. I appreciate that. Now let me see. If you could talk about maybe some coping tips, some things that people can do. Because I could speak for myself, like you say, during the pandemic. I wake up, go about my daily routine, watch TV, maybe have dinner, come back in the house. Then, like, in the summer it get dark late, but maybe after 5 or 6 o'clock, I would always get this feeling, like you say, worrying, thinking something bad's going to happen. So I just had to try, different things to take my mind off of the negativity.
Yeah. Well, a couple different strategies. I mean, so psychologists often think of ways that you can change your thought patterns, your mindset, but also ways that you could change your behavior. So one big change to thought patterns that I think is really effective is to try to bring in a little bit more gratitude. Right. So our mind naturally goes to the negative stuff, all the hassles out there in life. But you can train your mind to pay attention to the good things, the blessings. And one way that psychologists suggest you do that is by kind of writing what's known as a gratitude journal, which is just the simple act of scribbling down, hey, every day, here's a few things that I'm grateful for, 5 things that I'm really thankful for in life. And research shows that in as little as 2 weeks, a practice like that can start improving your overall well being, which is pretty cool. Another mindset shift that you can like try to bring about is to try to feel a little bit more self compassion, right? We often sort of beat ourselves up. We're often really self critical. That's especially true if we're worrying about something. It's not just that we're worried about it, but we're kind of beating ourselves up about the fact that we're worrying about it, right? And researchers often talk about how you can bring in a little bit more self-compassion, right? How can you be kind to yourself? Talk to yourself like you might talk to a really good friend that you're trying to comfort yourself. And so these are sort of mindset shifts or thought pattern shifts that we can use to feel a little bit happier. But there's also lots of evidence that we can change our behavior to feel happier. A big one that we were mentioning a little bit before is to get in a bit more social connection. Often if we're kind of feeling depressed or feeling stressed out, our first move is to isolate, right? Rather than kind of connect with friends on like hanging out at home watching TV or something. But what can you do to get a little bit more social connection and be with people, talk to people, and so on? Another behavior change is to do something nice for other people. One of the fastest ways to get out of a worrying cycle for yourself is to focus on somebody else. And this is a strategy that I talk about with my students all the time, right? If you're feeling stressed about an exam or something, what can you do to check in on someone else or do something kind for a person in your life or even for a stranger? And because research shows that one of the fastest ways to start feeling better and even one of the fastest ways to escape loneliness is to start focusing on other people.
Okay, I appreciate you sharing those. I'm gonna have to definitely try that with the journal. That's a
Yeah.
great idea. I haven't tried that one because I know for myself, I know one thing I did. I don't know how effective it'll be for other people, but I had started an urban garden, so I was
Mm-hmm.
growing fruits and vegetables. I bought some chickens. I had bought a beehive. So sometimes you might wake up on the wrong side of the bed, or you didn't get sleep, or something happened, but I know when I would wake up, the chickens, they'll wake you up because they're
Hmm.
chirping or
Hmm.
whatever. So I got to feed them. I got to get up. Then I got to water the fruits and vegetables, put my hands in the soil, cut a
Hmm.
couple leaves. And then I got to go into that beehive. And, I got to be focused. I got to pay attention
Yeah.
because the bees, they're not going to show you no mercy. So it's like I at least have my day starting off on a good foot. And after I spend that hour or two in the yard, I feel a whole lot better.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're using a couple practices we haven't talked about yet. I mean, one is what researchers call nature bathing, right? There's lots of evidence that simply like being around plants, being in nature, again, sticking your hands in the soil, that can be the kind of thing that really makes you feel better, increases positive emotion. It also sounds like your gardening gives you another thing that we know is a thought pattern that matters for happiness, which is sort of mindfulness, right? Being present. As you said, when you're interacting with the bees, you can't be ruminating about something that's coming up. You got to be, in the moment and really paying attention. And there's evidence that the more we can become mindful, the happier we are. So every moment that we spend being present, right, just kind of in flow in the moment, that winds up making us feel better. And the third thing it sounds like you get from your gardening is a little bit of exercise, right? So much evidence that exercise can reduce depression, reduce anxiety. You don't have to run a marathon, right? But just like moving your body and getting out and feeding the chickens and bending over, doing a little gardening, all that stuff winds up making us feel a lot better too. So sometimes we forget that our bodies are connected to our minds, and just the simple act of moving our body can wind up making us feel better. So yeah, so I love it. You have like a bunch of little happiness practices that are squished into one. I bet you get some social connection from the chickens too. You can get it from animals too if you need to.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And one more thing to add to that, when I harvest the fruit, the strawberries and the honey, man, it was the best I ever had. The ones I grew myself. So
Yeah. Yeah. And that sense of purpose, right? That you're creating this thing that you get to enjoy yourself, that you get to share with other people. All those things are so much better for our happiness, right? Than, I don't know, scrolling through, screen number two on Reddit or Instagram or something.
yeah, yeah, definitely. Now that kind of goes into my next question. You had a video where you was kind of speaking about experience over things. If you could touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, and so I think one of the things we forget is that experiences actually matter a lot, right? Those moments that you're out there, kind of feeding the chickens or interacting with the bees, they can kind of get you into flow. They can really make you feel like you're a little bit more present. And that winds up being different than the thing we often assume is associated with happiness, right? Like we can get this idea that happiness is associated with increasing our wealth, right? Or buying really nice things. I want to buy a really nice car, really nice clothes, and so on. But the research shows that material possessions don't really bring us as much happiness as we think. And one of the reasons is we sort of get used to them, right? You buy, I don't know, a new outfit and it's great the first time, but the next time it's like just your new outfit. You kind of get used to it. It's not kind of giving you that same happiness boost, right, that you were used to. But it turns out that when you use your money to purchase experiences, that doesn't work in the same way, right? So purchase experience would be like buy a concert or you go out with friends to a restaurant or maybe you go on vacation depending on your wealth and your means and things. Those things, like, you don't have time in that event to get used to it. A concert's what, like 2 or 3 hours, a vacation's only going to be a couple days, right? Your brain doesn't have time to get used to it. And that means you continue to get this sort of happiness boost that comes from those experiences. And so the science shows that people who spend their money and invest in experiences often wind up being happier than those who tend to spend money on material goods. So that's another hack. If you want to figure out how to use money to feel as happy as possible, definitely invest in experiences rather than in things.
Yeah, that's a good point. Because I know, like, it was maybe 20 years ago, right? This when the flat screen TVs was out, I had bought one. I spent like $2,000 on the TV. I got to
Mhm.
put on the wall and everything, but I didn't watch the TV as much as I thought it would. It had 3D and everything, so it just was kind of like just sitting there. And as time went on, obviously more everybody have a flat screen
Yeah.
TV now. It depreciated with value, and I figure if I live to be 75, that's not something that I'm going to talk about to my kids and grandkids. Like, yeah, I bought a flat screen
Yeah.
TV. They not gonna even
Yeah.
understand.
Yeah.
So, but I can say I traveled the world. I've been to 70
Mhm.
countries. I invested in like studying abroad. I volunteered in an orphanage and community centers, and taking martial art classes and dance classes, learning how to do salsa and stuff like that. Those are things that I will remember forever.
Mhm. And that's one of the reasons that experiences are so kind of happiness boosting, is that you can share them with other people, right? If you go on and talk to some friend about, oh, my flat screen TV or this new car I bought or this new outfit, it's boring. Like, they don't want to talk to you about that. But if you talk to them about, like, oh, I just took this cool martial arts class, or oh, I went to this concert, like, people want to hear about your experiences in a way that's kind of boring to connect with people about your material goods. You kind of sound like, honestly, you sound like a jerk if you're like bragging about all your material goods, but you don't sound as bad when you talk about your cool experiences in life. And that's one of the reasons that experiences make us happy, is that they let us be social, right? Often we include other people in our experiences. Like, if you're taking that martial arts class, you're going with other people. Often we go with other people when we're traveling or going on vacation. You don't often include people as much in material goods, especially things like clothing or like some smartphone or something like that. And so experiences is a way to get even more social connection.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Okay, so if you can you share the website to the courses, the podcast, and for the viewers that want to
Yeah, definitely. So the podcast is called The Happiness Lab, and you can look it up wherever you get your podcasts. You can check out the online courses. The courses are called The Science of Wellbeing and The Science of Wellbeing for Teens. If you just Google Wellbeing class at Yale, you'll probably find it, but it's available on Coursera.org. So that's the word course, ERA.org. And you can find them all there.
Okay. Thank you again. I really, really appreciate you. You shared a wealth of information. I'm still processing, and I'm sure the viewers would definitely find it useful. I'm thankful for the work that you have done, and I definitely look forward to what you got going on in the future.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you. It was an honor. All right. Thank you, viewers, for tuning in to another episode of Taye Speaks. Until next time, peace.